Hello, world history students. Today's lecture is Unit 8, Part 6, the French Revolution. This has a lot to do with things that we've talked about over the last few days in Unit 8. So I hope this makes sense as a major part of European history, a major turning point in European history. And hopefully you find the EQs pretty easily as I go through them. First of all, we need to talk about traditional French society. French society in the 1700s and before was divided into three classes called estates. The first estate is made up of the Catholic clergy. The second estate was made up of the rich nobles. This goes back to feudalism, if you remember when we were talking about feudalism in the first semester. And these two groups make up probably about 3%, 4% tops of French society, and yet they have privileges that others don't have to pay taxes like others don't. And so everybody else, the 96, 97% who belong to the third estate, that's people who live in towns and people who live in the countryside of all different kinds of wealth categories, they're really kind of angry at the state of France at this point in time. They have very few rights. They paid much more in taxes than the rich or the privileged of the first two estates. Well, some of the causes of the revolution, of course, would be the Enlightenment ideals of challenging traditional ways of doing things and coming up with ideas of how to change politics, for example, or how to change religious policy. The notion that maybe everyone should be equal is part of the Enlightenment. And so those ideas are spreading at the same time that France is experiencing a very poor economy because of many different wars that the French had been in, the last one being actually the Revolutionary War of American colonists versus Britain. Because of all of the wars, because the king, Louis XVI, and his wife, Marie Antoinette, spent a lot of money, they charged the Third Estate high taxes. Around this period of time, 1788, there was a bad harvest, which really ruined the economy. People were very hungry and very angry. And on top of that, over many years, going all the way back to Louis XIV, the French kings had been collecting debt based on everything that they were spending on their militaries. So lots of problems going on, and then you have a king and a queen who are not the right people to be on the throne at this point in time. Louis XVI was an absolutist ruler, trying to rule without a parliament and trying to collect revenue and so on. His wife Marie Antoinette was an Austrian woman that nobody really liked. They thought she wasted a lot of money. In fact, her nickname was Madame Deficit. Well, in 1789, Louis XVI called the Parliament. It's called the Estates General for the first time in 175 years, basically just to deal with his debt. He didn't know how to collect enough taxes, since he wasn't collecting taxes really from the church or from the nobles in order to pay off his debt. Well, this parliament or this estates general gets together and they started demanding too much, especially the third estate or the everybody else part of it. They were demanding basically too much enlightenment. They were demanding, for example, doing away with privileges, doing away maybe with the king's absolute power. And so the king tries to shut it down by calling in troops. As those troops are making their way to Versailles, the people of Paris and people in the countryside decided to support the Estates General or support this parliament by storming in Paris the Bastille. This happens on July 14, 1789, a prison with just a few prisoners and a kind of fortress that had a lot of guns and gunpowder in it. And then people in the countryside are storming the nobles' chateaus, trying to end the nobles being the bigwigs or the people in the countryside with all of the power. Well, the king realizes that the people are up in arms, and he sort of gives in to them. He allows this Estates General to become a national assembly, and this national assembly then declares all men equal and starts working on taking away the power of the king, making him a constitutional monarch, and then also taking away land from the church, which will be sold to pay off the king's debts, and taking away some of the powers of the church as well. Well, that is not just some of the causes of the French Revolution, but also how the revolution happened or how it began. And it continued on into the early 1790s as the pro-revolutionary forces were pushing the revolution forward. And fighting against the counter-revolutionary forces who liked the old ways of doing things. So the revolutionaries were really more about democracy, about letting all men vote, and maybe taking away most all of the powers of the Catholic Church, and perhaps even doing away with the Catholic Church. The counter-revolutionaries were much more traditional, as I said, supporting the power of the nobles or maybe the power of the king, and supporting the Catholic Church or religious people. Well, the revolutionaries decided that King Louis and his wife were guilty of treason. They had been against the revolution really from the get-go, and at one point in time even tried to escape France. And so they were tried for treason, and King Louis was executed first, and a few months later, his wife Marie Antoinette was executed as well. These executions are just the beginnings of a large reign of terror, or a whole bunch of executions that are done at the under the control of Maximilien Robespierre, a former member of the parliament who was trying to take out all of the counter-revolutionaries that he possibly could. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of people are killed in this reign of terror that lasts a few months. Many of them are guilty of counter-revolution or are against the revolution, but some of them are just kind of innocent people. Many of the people, too, are being killed by this new head chopping device called the guillotine. And the guillotine is much better than the way that they were executing people, for example, the opponents of Henry VIII back during the English Reformation. This machine works effectively rather than an axeman trying to chop somebody's head off. This machine is pretty much sure to work every single time, cutting people's heads off. Part of the reason why they execute people in this way is they want everyone to be executed equally. It used to be that noble people had their heads chopped off and non-noble people were sort of tortured to death. So they think they're doing a nice thing here, but it probably doesn't feel nice to the people who are being killed in this way. Well, this counter-revolution versus revolution and reign of terror was spreading a lot of bloodshed and making people miserable. The other countries in Europe felt like France was out of control and wars had broken out between other nations and France. One of the French generals who was really being quite effective was this guy by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. People were tired of conflict at this point in time. Bonaparte decides to seize power, and he does so in 1799. He wants to spread France's power across Europe, and since he's already fighting all of these countries and defeating them one by one, he becomes a very powerful figure in all of Europe. The thing that separates Louis XVI and Napoleon Bonaparte is their popularity, I think. Bonaparte is just as absolutist as Louis XVI was, but he is popular from all of the wars that he's winning, and he spends about 20 years or so winning war after war after war. And he's beating coalitions of states. So it's France versus a whole bunch of countries all at the same time. Napoleon is still able to win. That makes him popular. He also has a very efficient bureaucracy that's collecting taxes pretty equally. People like that. They feel like no favoritism is being shown. And part of his accomplishments is also the creation of the Napoleonic Code, a system of law that makes sure that everybody is treated equally. Once again, people kind of like that. He also is able to smooth over differences between the Catholic Church and the French government or other French people by making a deal with the Pope, and the Pope then more or less blesses Napoleon as the leader of the French, and Napoleon protects Catholics, but really anybody else wants to believe whatever they want to believe. Well, as I said, Napoleon is a very effective military leader. He conquers most all of Europe. This is something that really hadn't been done since Roman times. He isn't able to conquer Britain. However, the British live on an island and they have a very effective fleet. Napoleon, though, takes over much of Europe, and he forces the states that he takes over to be allied with him. He gets tax money from them. He sometimes drafts their soldiers and makes them fight alongside his French troops. Now, the French being very, very successful starts to create a very important ism for the 19th century, which is nationalism. It's a feeling of love for your own country. It's a feeling of wanting to have your own country and wanting to have a ruler that is just like you. So when the French are using other people's soldiers in their army, people don't like that very much. They don't want that to be the case. They want their soldiers to fight for their own country, and they want their leader not to be a Frenchman. They want their leader to be whatever country they're from. Well, Napoleon in 1812 gets involved in a war with the Russians. The Russians are tired of listening to Napoleon and basically kind of tell him no for the first time in a while. And Napoleon gets mad at that and he invades Russia with French troops and a whole bunch of troops that he's forcing alongside his French troops. The Russians are very difficult to take over. If you ever have the chance to invade Russia, I suggest that you don't. The Russians do this thing called scorched earth policy. They try to make sure that whoever the invader is, nothing good is going to fall into their hands. So they burn fields, they poison wells, they burn down cities, and so on. At the same time, too, at some point in time, because it takes so long for a nation to conquer Russia, winter sets in, and Russian winters are a lot like Minnesota winters. They're very, very harsh, and generally the soldiers freeze to death. This is what happens to Napoleon's troops, and as they try to rush out of Russia to escape the winter and to escape not having anything to eat, they're defeated. All of the countries in Europe more or less join together to then chase Napoleon back to France and defeat him, and Napoleon is then exiled to an island where he spends the rest of his life. The end of this Napoleonic era, the end of the French Revolution, is called the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna is a meeting of the winners of the war against Napoleon. They put what they believe is a legitimate king, the brother of Louis XVI, on the throne. This would be Louis XVIII, and they give France, or Louis actually gives France a constitution. So France has a constitutional monarchy coming out of all of these years of political upheaval. And once again, all people are still equal in France. At the Congress of Vienna, the winners wanted to have peace instead of war, which they have for a number of decades. They also want legitimate rulers like a Louis XVIII instead of a Napoleon. And they wanted more or less the states of Europe to have a kind of balance of power. They didn't want to have a superpower like France that's able to dominate all the rest. So for the next 20, 30 years or so, we have those things: peace, legitimate rulers, and a kind of balance of power between European states, with that lurking nationalism, that idea that a Germany should be created, an Italy should be created. Those states don't exist yet, and so on. Well, I hope that I answered all of the EQs that you needed answered. And if you have any questions, please shoot me an email or just ask. Thanks. Have a great day.